so much for joining us tonight. We are so excited to have Jessie Burton and Soon Wiley here tonight to discuss Jessie's new book, House of Fortune. I'm just going to go over a quick few things, and I'm going to give them some quick introductions, and then we will let them start. So once again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. If you haven't heard already, this fall we are distributing frequent flyer cards. So here's how it works for each in-person event you attend. By the end of the year, by the end of the event, you'll receive a stamp. And attending an event with a best-selling author is a reward in itself. But this fall, we're upping the game. Attend 5 events, and you'll receive a $5 gift card and an R.J. Julia journal. Attend 10 events, and you'll receive a $25 gift card and an R.J. Julia journal, plus a book lover sticker. This applies for in-person events both at our Madison and Middletown stores, as well as all R.J. Julia hosted events off the premises. If you don't have one already, be sure to pick up your card downstairs. We will be doing a signing line after the event, so you can get one there, and make sure you receive your first stamp or another stamp if you have one already. Now I'm going to move into introducing our guests. So first, a native of Nyack, New York, Soon Wiley received his BA in English and Philosophy from Connecticut College. He holds an MFA in Creative Writing from Wichita State University. His writing has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize and earned him fellowships in both Wyoming and France. He resides in Connecticut with his wife and their 2 cats. When We Fell Apart is his debut novel, and we do have copies available for purchase downstairs. And Jessie Burton's first novel, The Miniaturist, was a New York Times bestseller and was adapted into a PBS series starring Anya Taylor-Joy. Jessie's second novel, The Muse, was also a #1 international bestseller. Jessie has written essays and reviews for the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. We are so excited to have her here tonight to discuss House of Fortune. If you haven't purchased a copy already and would like to do so, we do have copies available downstairs, but you can do so after the event. I'm now going to turn things over to them to get things started.
Well, thank you to everyone for coming out. There's even a thunderstorm warning alert, so you braved it, but the clouds have abated. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming tonight. I wasn't familiar with Jessie's work up until about a week ago, and I got this lovely, mysterious package that arrived in my mailbox, and it was the House of Fortune. And in truth, I read it in about a night, and I felt like I was a kid again, actually reading Harry Potter. I just felt completely. My wife was like, "What is going on? It's never, you weren't even like this when you were working on your own book. Like you're actually enjoying yourself." And so I just felt completely transported. Just truly a feat. So congratulations.
Thank you.
So first off, I'm interested in this business of sequels, and The Miniaturist was your debut, and you've written subsequent books in between, and now you've got this book. When did it raise its head as a possibility? Were you working on other books? Did you set it aside? What was that kind of process like?
Yeah. Well, when I finished The Miniaturist, I really thought I was done with that universe of 1686 Amsterdam. That
was
family.
It like
Oh yeah.
Thank God I'm done, or was it like a?
I think it wasn't so much when I finished the novel. It was after I finished promoting the novel for about, no word of a lie, like 18 months. In various countries. I was like, I cannot do this anymore. I need to move on. And the novel transformed my life. Really, because it was not, I did not expect it to be so successful as it turned out to be. I honestly would have been happy with 5,000 hardbacks sold, because the thing was to be published, whatever that actually meant. I didn't really think much beyond that goal. And it was so transformative in a very destabilizing way, professionally, personally. It just tipped my life upside down. And I think I associated so much of that kind of tumult with the book, and I wanted to move on. And I didn't actually lift its covers for 6 years. It was like there was a force field around it. And I also felt very strongly when the book did well. I didn't want to just be known for that book. I knew that there were other novels I wanted to write. And However, even 2 years after it published, so around 2016, I was writing a few scenes, and then I realised it was too much too soon, and perhaps it was the dregs of a previous book, you know, like an exorcism, and I moved away. And I think it's partly the character of Nella Brandt, who is the protagonist in this book, as well as in the first novel I wrote. She and I feel a strange affinity with her in a way that I don't necessarily feel with any of my other characters. So whilst I did move on and write other books that I am equally proud of and each of them have a unique part to play in my life, the world of the Miniaturist, the world of Nella, occupies a very different space, and in the end it turned out that she wasn't done with me, and I felt ready around 2018, I think it was, to go back, and I wanted to go back. It wasn't that I sort of felt like I have to do this at all, because of course it could have really backfired and, you know, been a damp squib, and so yeah. And I just sort of, it was a bit nerve-wracking at first, reacquainting myself with Nella. And, you know, if you've fallen out with a friend or something and you're going to have a reunion and you feel so many feelings, but you don't know how it's going to go, and it was a bit frosty at first, and then the ice breaks and you get on as if nothing had ever, as if time hadn't passed. That's how I felt. And although it is being described both as a sequel and as a standalone, I don't really think of the book in either of those terms. It's just a continuation. It's just a flow.
Yeah, that was
of the world.
That was one of the things that interested me, was that I haven't read the first one, and yet I didn't feel as if, I did have to do a little bit of research, but I didn't feel as if it did feel like a standalone or a continuation of sorts.
Well, I wanted it to be like that because I didn't, you know, this isn't a fantasy novel. It's not sort of a fixed set of rules and histories that you have to know in order to enjoy it. I wanted it to be, you know, you could read it without knowing the first book.
So you had mentioned your affinity towards Nell as a character, and in this book I think, I didn't get a chance to count, but the number of point of views that we get is, I think, at least 3, right? Or 2.
We get the interiority of Thea and Nella.
And I was kind of wondering, what was that like, jumping between those 2 points of view? For you, was that, what benefits did it have, and what were some of the drawbacks? And was there, I mean, obviously you had mentioned that you had this real affinity towards Nella, but what was it like to embody Thea and her precocious 18-year-old, you know, her desires?
I was a precocious 18-year-old once upon a time.
She was a convincing precocious 18-year-old, I'll say that.
Yeah, I think a lot of my novels have this dynamic. There's often a younger woman, 18, 19, 20, with an older woman in her life, be she in her late 30s or 40s, or in some of my novels in her 70s, often in dialogue with each other. But this was the first one where we got both their points of view about the same issues, and I think what I wanted to put them both on was a path to where they start deeply misunderstanding one another. And I should clarify, Thea is Nella's niece. So at the end of The Miniaturist, Nella is left with this little newborn, and who is motherless, and she becomes the kind of de facto mother figure, fairly reluctantly. And when we meet Nella in this book, she's pretty rageful,
resentful,
she feels like she's lived her life on behalf of other people, and her own life has been stuck in first gear. But it was heartening and, yes, I suppose special for me to work out a way that these two women finally come to understand the other's point of view. Why Nella is so obsessed with trying to find a husband for Thea to marry her off, because it is coming from a place of love and need to find security for her. But it's also a little bit projection of what happened to her. It's almost like vengeance. It's unpleasant. And Thea is a classic case of a young woman who has so much spirit and fire and is headstrong, and is so full of her own convictions, which is so wonderful and so important to have. But exactly, it can lead you to pain, and that's what happens to Thea. She I don't want to give it all away, but she
no spoilers.
No spoilers. It's no spoilers to say that at the beginning of the book, Thea is desperately, deeply in love. I think she might be in lust. And I think perhaps at her age she cannot differentiate. Well, sometimes it's hard to differentiate at any age, but she cannot separate the talents of this man from his actual personhood. So anyway, I do seem, the more novels you write, the more you seem to see patterns in your habits.
You keep returning to and that you're interested in.
And I have a lot of girls in my books who are always on the cusp of adulthood, who have childlike qualities. I don't mean childishness, but childlike qualities, and a sense of needing guidance, needing an older figure to guide. And there is another sort of mother figure in this book, which is the actress Rebecca Bosman, who's more like the good angel. But in all my books, there's a novel I wrote that hasn't been published in the States called The Confession, which is my third novel, and that's exactly the same, like a motherless girl, but it's set contemporaneously in London in 2017-18, who is on the quest for her mother, and finds instead a 73-year-old reclusive novelist who once had an affair with her. So
I'm hooked.
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah. But yeah, there's clearly I have this. Maybe it's like a split self. Like I'm working out something about myself, my upbringing, my childhood, my move into young adulthood, and being a young woman, and then how you negotiate finding peace or finding a place for yourself in the world. And I think whereas The Miniaturist was very what you would call a quite, it had its mystery elements and magic real elements, but it was quite historically, sort of detailed. This one I would say is a bit more of a psychodrama, a bit more of an examination of a family's dynamic.
Yeah, and I was watching an interview that you gave, and I was struck by this question of whether this is a historical novel and whether we want to call it that. And you had mentioned that you were interested more in giving us the impression or the feel of the city during this time period. And I just thought that was just so interesting because, of course, as a writer, you have to make these decisions, right? Am I going to go into the nitty-gritty of what this specific I've done all this research as a writer, and now you get so excited, and suddenly you start writing and you realize you've written all these details that are totally superfluous. And I think that in a way, like that idea of the impression is actually more helpful, right, in this case, because it isn't just a historical novel that is obsessive about getting every single detail correctly.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, a plus, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would hope so, because I feel like all the characters in this book are the most modern people to be in existence so far, and they're not having a self-conscious historic moment every time they step out onto the cobbled canals of Amsterdam. These are the finest houses that mankind has built, the sturdiest ships with the strongest sails that are sailing out to conquer, other territories, and that's just everyday fact to them. And you can get nerdily bogged down in the minutiae of a period of history, especially something like the Dutch Golden Age, which is so full of like archival richness, paintings and houses and ornaments and objects and documents. Excuse me.
Clearly you've done your research, you've got all that information there.
Yeah, and then you just have to sort of put it to one side and write the story, and try and weave in a sense for the reader of a sense of place, but not a slightly static, arresting energy of that place.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I loved about this book is that, when I often think about a successful setting, it's a vibe, it's a feeling.
It's a vibe.
Right? It feels like London, or it feels like Amsterdam. And in fact, the way something smells or the way the wind feels on your neck is actually more, you have a better chance of convincing the reader that that's a vivid place than this specific, stained glass window of so-and-so year, that actually it's those vivid details that really are evocative.
Isn't it like that Chekhov quote, tell me about, don't tell me
Yeah,
about the moon,
which I'm going to
don't tell me
misquote.
about the, I'm going to misquote it as well.
But tell me how it
tell me
makes
how
me
it
feel,
exactly,
etc.
or like how it falls upon the face or something. Yeah.
You said you got it, but more than
I think, we'll go fudge that one a bit, but
So
the spirit was there.
the spirit was there. One of the themes that I found interesting, and I think this connects a little bit to Nella and Thea and even Rebecca, is this idea of art being, so Thea is this huge theater goer, right? She loves the playhouses of Amsterdam. It's her escape, it's her balm, it's where she goes to escape the house where her guardians are constantly arguing and worrying about money, and this is kind of her fantasy land, right? The place that she goes. But while art is it's a place that saves her, it's a good thing, it's represented in this positive light, but then there are some dangers that art represents in the book, I think, where you can misrepresent art, right? Thea thinks, I know what love is, I have seen all of these plays, I've read all these books, I know what true emotions are, and Nella, you don't know a damn thing, right? Because I've read these books, I've seen these plays. So I was just wondering, was that that theme of art and some of the dangers and also the pleasures that it represents, I was kind of interested.
I'm so glad you picked up on that, and I expect you did because you're a writer.
Yeah,
as well.
I was like, oh, I love it. I was like, if I was writing this, I would just write all of these chapters, and then my editor would be like, this needs to be one chapter. It doesn't need to be 7. So.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge element of the book is the power and the danger of art, and I think traditionally we just say, oh, art and creativity are great forces of good in the world, and I would say in general, yes, they are, because listening to a piece of music or watching a movie or going to the theatre or reading a book, sometimes you can process your own feelings safely without it being you, or you can ventriloquize and sort of and have a sort of therapeutic or cathartic moment that way. And I'm sure that's why so many of us read and why music moves us, because it unlocks something in us that perhaps on a quotidian basis we cannot express. I think my point in the book is that the power of thought, the power of imagination can be crushing on an individual, and you can get locked in a cycle of belief or thought that can be very destructive to yourself. And it's a fine line to tread between being not cynical but realistic or more pragmatic, and also allowing for the beauties of a fantastic performance of an actress like Rebecca to transport you. And that's why in the book I do a lot of backstage stuff, because I used to be an actress.
Okay.
I don't know if you ever stopped being one, but I haven't acted for 11 years. And I'm very conscious of the amount of practice, like with writing, that goes into making something look completely spontaneous and off the cuff. And Rebecca says it's not magic, it's practice. And whilst not wanting to burst the bubble, we work very hard as creative people to offer a very brief moment of escape or clarity, and it's up to the reader or the playgoer to interpret it on their own terms. And I guess I wanted to explore that, and that's where the character of the miniaturist, who is in the first book, obviously it's called Miniaturist, and this book is a commentary as well on perception, personal, subjective perception, faith. You see what you want to see.
That one thing can mean something to all of the different characters. They each have a different theory or idea of what the return of the miniatures
exactly
means.
And I think this book, for the sort of first 2/3, is quite chaotic. Not chaotic in the sense for a reader, but like they are all at odds with each other. They are all dealing, particularly I think Nella's interior world is there on the page for the reader, but she's trying to make a reckoning with her life. Otto Thea's father, who was an enslaved man who came from originally the kingdom of Dahomey, which we now call Benin. He was then transported to Suriname, to a plantation, and then taken by Johannes, Nella's husband, to Amsterdam and emancipated, because in Holland slavery was illegal, which was slightly double standards,
right,
because they were obviously enjoying the bounties of sugar plantations offshore. But he's making a reckoning as well with, you know, this world he's lived in since he was 16, and I think a lot of it coalesces around the pineapple and
his idea and his.
Yes. Are we going to find a new Eden on the shore of Amsterdam?
So I did this. I was thinking about Otto a little bit, and as I was reading it, and I don't know if this is just because I'm such a big Jane Austen fan, but I was reminded a little bit of Mr. Bennet, in that, not in his speech or in his mannerisms, but Mr. Bennet cares so deeply about Elizabeth that he almost hinders her marriage prospects, right? Or he isn't quite, and Otto, I feel like, loves his daughter dearly. He knows that Nella's idea, right? She needs to get married. Marriage this is the thing, right? That is going to.
It seems like the only solution.
This is the only solution, and it's what's practical, right? And it's what's going to save our family.
Yeah.
And he seems to be reticent. He doesn't want to accept that kind of reality.
No.
So I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts were on his role as a father, and how you see kind of his relationship with Thea.
I suppose it is exactly that, like a reluctance to, whilst Thea is safe within the four walls of the house on the Herengracht Canal, she's safe, and I think he's experiencing fairly, well, Freud hadn't been invented at that point, but like, you know, slight possessive fears about, you know, no one's good enough for her, but also layered heavily on top of that is Thea's racial
her
ethnicity.
identity, right?
Yeah, her heritage is her father is black and her mother was white, and nobody better than Otto has understood what that might mean for his daughter, and why certain individuals in Amsterdam society might be attracted to Thea, because she is an exotic option, whereas Nella has not experienced that. So he's.
And you do have a number of lovely arguments about that where the dialogue is quite amazing. I mean, the scenes in which both of them are almost trying to outdo each other. Well, you don't know what I've been through, right? And you don't know what I've been through. And, you know, we don't get Otto's, we don't jump into his mind, but through Nella, she recognizes, right, that of course I don't know as a black man what he has experienced, and I can't know.
Especially because Otto does keep it very much
he doesn't
to himself.
Kind of express it.
I did, as part of my work on it, excuse me, I've been doing a lot of events, and my voice is vaguely trailing off. I've lost my train of thought now. What was I talking about?
Otto, and I think, well, I had mentioned his point of view a little bit, but.
Yeah, no, I had a good point, and then I coughed. I might come back to it, sorry.
Okay.
Just completely forgotten.
Where did the idea of the pineapple come from? I know that it's a very kind of odd question, but I was just intrigued. When it appeared, it seemed.
I just remembered soon.
Okay,
sorry,
good.
There you go.
I'll hold that question.
But pineapples.
Pineapples, Otto.
Otto, yes. I just wanted to say, like, I did write a lot of Otto's interior world, and mainly for my own need.
So never an intention to put it in a book. Just I need to know this.
I need to know. I mean, I honestly have like hundreds of that, probably about 100,000 words of Otto's life.
Is that written in third person or first person? Or is it?
Pretty much first, because I did it that he was attempting to explain to his daughter, and then I realised he's not going to do that because it's a handing on of trauma, and he's locking it in so she doesn't know. But of course, she's longing to know, where did my father come from? It's just this name on a map. I know nothing. I know nothing about him, and I know nothing about my mother.
Yeah, and we should also say the reticence to say anything about kind of her origins and her mother, and there's family that does not say much.
No, they don't say much.
You know.
And then there's one blow up where Nella loses her temper, and it's a cathartic but very damaging moment where she just loses it. But that's not so much about, Otto's life. So the pineapple.
Yes, the pineapple.
Yeah. So all the research I'd done for the Miniaturist came in super handy for this one, and I didn't have to do that much new investigation. But I knew that I wanted to bring in Nella's childhood home, which is alluded to in the first novel, and I left it a bit like crumbs in the forest. I didn't realise it at the time, but I had this escape valve, this pressure escape valve of Assendelft, which is a rural sort of settlement, probably about an hour outside Amsterdam, where Nella comes from, where she was taken from aged 18 to the city of Amsterdam to be married to Johannes. And it became in the novel, and I knew it was crucial that this book couldn't just stay in Amsterdam, that I needed to move them on. Whilst looking back, this book goes forward. It's like a dual direction novel. And the pineapple at the time was a metaphor, I suppose, for the sort of the seeds, no pun intended, of global capitalism, of moving seeds, flowers and fruit from the East Indies and the West Indies.
Bringing it all.
Yeah, like cocoa and pepper, they all came from the East, and then they were cultivated in the West, in the Caribbean, and then brought back over. And particularly Dutch engineers and botanists wanted to see if they could grow these exotic fruits in Dutch soil with like northern temperatures, and so there was a lot of stove houses being built.
Once I saw that phrase in the book, I had to do some research.
Oh, yeah.
So it was just so fascinating. But I just thought, what a perfect metaphor for Thea, right? Can she, grow? Can she have a normal life? Can she flourish in Amsterdam, right? In a place where she is viewed as foreign, right, or viewed as exotic.
Yeah. It's so lovely meeting someone who just gets the book.
I read the Spark Notes.
But
I get one of the large things that I left reading the book was female friendship, and I mean, you would kind of mention that in the beginning, or maybe it's female mentorship a little bit. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and
there are a lot of fairy godmothers in my novels.
Well, I was intrigued by Nella because there's a scene where Nella goes to a ball, and the whole point of the ball is to find Thea a match. But, and forgive me if I'm misreading, but Nella seems to get she has moments of thinking like, well, what if this could be me, right? Or a gentleman comes over and she thinks, oh, he's coming over to talk to me. So I was also just interested in that, and how difficult it seemed for female characters to forge friendships or trusting relationships in the face of having to compete almost, right? The system that they're working in to compete against others, to find merit suitors, right? To compete for attention or to compete for social status.
Yeah.
And how difficult it is for women in the novel to kind of, Rebecca's like the most successful because she's outside of, she's not worrying about any of that stuff. She's the actor. She could give two hoots about the ball.
Yeah.
But I don't even know if there's a question in there, but I'm just interested in how you see kind of female friendships and relationships.
Yeah. I think between, Nella that's quite an interesting conundrum for her, because her dominant or sort of public face that she's giving is care and solicitousness to her niece's well-being and future.
Right, this is like this is her everything.
Yeah.
Her whole identity
But she's a human, and I think there is natural envy. Thea is stunning. She's 18. She's youthful and, you know, skin glows, and she only needs to get ready 10 minutes and she looks like $1 million, you know, and Nella's just like, it's so unfair. And I always remember a friend of mine when we were at university who was very beautiful, and she told me that her mother ended up going to therapy about it, and I was so shocked. I was like, what kind? And now I've got a bit older, I sort of I understand it a bit, like to sort of sense that you're being supplanted and that perhaps you're not so valued for other qualities that you have. And I think it's all compounded for Nella because her marriage was a bit of a dud. I mean, she had a great friendship with her husband, but he didn't want to be married to her, and he didn't want to procreate, and yes, he was executed, which is again not a spoiler. And so she just sort of feels like her life has been on ice, and she looks at these wealthier widows in Dutch society, in Amsterdam society, who are loving their life. You know, they haven't got the obligations of the marital bed, but they've got all the money, and they're just having a great time, you know. And she's just like, well, we're broke, and I've got no one who's interested in me. And then when she realizes what Thea's been up to with her lover, like, that's again this conflict of protectiveness and also sort of sexual jealousy.
Right.
And does Nella actually kind of want Thea out of the house so she can like breathe? And these are complex things that Nella, you know, isn't so sure how to deal with. And I'm pretty sure that, like, you know, as novelists we pick up things way back when, and it's always stayed with me, my friend's mother who went to therapy.
Yeah.
And
they're here right now.
oh God, can you imagine? They'd be furious with me. Well, no names. But yeah, it's a, you know, why should a woman just be like this saint? You know, yes, she can love her niece and care for her, but also be, you know, she has autonomy and she has curiosity.
Thea also doesn't make it very easy on her.
No, she's bloody
like,
awful
you don't know anything. You know nothing about love.
She's very frustrating.
Yeah.
She's very headstrong, and you know, it's that difficult thing, because you could argue, well, she's got a point. And actually, I had a reader come up to me in the UK who read The Miniaturist when she was 14, and she's now 22, reading The House of Fortune. And she said, oh, when I read The Miniaturist, I was all like, go on, Nella, you can do it, you're 18, and now I'm reading The House of Fortune. I'm like, what are you doing, Thea? You know, and it was very heartening, because, you know, as you grow as a person, I guess, like, through the years, you understand that life is not black and white at all, and it's very complicated.
Which is certainly, I think, the lesson that Thea learns by the end, right? I mean, she learns just how complicated everything is. Yeah, and that I think it's Cornelia, the maidservant, who says to her, you know, sometimes it's better that people don't tell everything. Like, secrets are not always bad. You know, to have a degree of privacy, interiority, actually in a weird way keeps you close to the people that you love. And, you know, for Thea, who thinks everything should be turned inside honesty
out,
you know, openness always, no matter what, no matter the cost.
That might be the Englishness in me, that I'm like, keep the reserve. So you're talking about Austen, it's like Eleanor Dashwood versus Marianne. It's like that's
a great example.
That's their energy, I think, with each other.
Well, this has been great. I don't want to take up too much time if we've got any questions from our
Actually, I could listen to you two both speak. I mean, you're just wonderful together. And you're so insightful. Yes,
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we can carry on.
We can carry on.
Yes.
Okay. Although, is that putting you on the spot?
No, I don't think so. I did have, and you know, maybe it's just because I'm a homeowner now, so this is the only thing. I'm only worried about money now. But
there's a lot of money issues in this.
Oh, I love this quote from Nella. And, you know, material concerns, I mean, it's almost immediate, right? And I think they're not, this circles back to the art as well, but they're not only selling, you know, the furniture, they're selling their artwork, right? They're selling, you know,
they're stripping the walls.
Right, there's this kind of gutting scene where they're selling this, I imagine it is like a Turner painting or something.
Yeah, it's like the equivalent. Actually, I saw it at the, funnily enough, at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston yesterday, a Backhausen shipwreck.
Okay,
scene.
and this is a painting that Thea's mother picked, right?
Yeah, it was
Correct?
her favourite novel, but
Okay.
it's a novel, favourite painting that was hanging
Oh.
over the dining room
Yeah.
table, this kind of grim,
And I think
allegorical.
Stella says that, or Nella says that, right? Of like, of course, her favorite painting would be a shipwreck or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But, you know, and so there's this gutting scene where they have to sell this, right? And Nella gets an appraiser. But I love this quote, and I think this is maybe I'm wrong, but from that big blow up she has with Otto, where she says, "Money saved us. Money is a shield. It's a weapon. It's a blessing."
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, obviously, money concerns is a fantastic plot engine driver, but thematically, how did that was money always going to be the material concerns?
Mm-hmm.
Was that always going to be in the book, or did that kind of arise from their character and circumstances?
I can't quite remember exactly where it's sort of the genesis of the financial precarity, but I think quite early on in the fulminating of the book, I knew that dramatically it would be useful for them to be on their uppers rather than like living in fantastic wealth, because where do you go from there, really? And it kind of made sense that they wouldn't be doing well, because Otto, being a black man, is not going to be respected.
And he runs into some employment trouble.
Yeah,
early on.
and they just sold off parcel after parcel of land. And I think as well, it was useful to me. So the first novel had a sort of sense of a theatre set. This house was like a set. And now what I was doing with this book was stripping it back literally and figuratively. And money talked in this society, perhaps even more than religion. It was a port city that kind of, it didn't fully overlook your ethnicity or
but
your
it was
nationality.
Commerce, it was trade.
It was commerce and trade, and I think perhaps traditionally in the presentation of Dutch Golden Age, we don't see that diversity. And I have noticed, like, when I went back in July 2020, there's been some very deep dives into the archives and a total representation of Amsterdam life, to the point where I went to the National Library, and they had this exhibition called Black Amsterdammers, and I found a man called Christian Schwartz, who did inherit a house on the Herengracht from his former master. So that's a bit of a tangent, but it sort of ties into wealth and who has it, and it's crucial to this world, and it's useful as a novelist to start with, what's their existential challenge, what's their obstacle, and of course each character reacts differently.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know much about the Dutch culture, but I think what you're alluding to is this idea of, like, I was thinking when I was reading your book about Edith Wharton, who's also one of my favorite authors, and old money versus new money, and in this reality, it doesn't matter how much money you have, it's the wrong kind of money. But in your book, Nella at least seems to allude to, like, it's just about the money. Like, it doesn't matter how we get it, what we were before it, but if we have more of it than other people, like, that's what matters.
Yeah, and I think because there was a bit of a push against the sort of traditional idea of hierarchical wealth from the English, who were aristocrats and dukes and duchesses. Yeah. I think the Dutch prided themselves on being more pragmatic, hard-working merchants rather than layabout inherited wealth. That said, there was still like a golden
Still had your estates
elite.
And your...
Yeah, and like people giving jobs to each other and that sort of thing. But yeah, it was, to the point where it was quite common for a wife to join her husband in his business and work with him. The men were in the main smart enough to realise two brains were better than one, and if a man died, his widow often continued the business. I'm not saying it was a feminist paradise by a long shot, but there was a lot more pragmatism about how do we keep the Republic afloat. They had literally shored the city and of Amsterdam and the other surrounding areas from the swamp, from the marshes with polders, and so there was this fear that if they stopped working hard and stopped giving thanks, that the waves would come and claim it all back, but at the same time they couldn't kind of help showing off a bit that you know they'd made so much money. So it was like this kind of paradox of opulence and show-offery and Calvinist fear that they were being, you know, they were going to be punished.
Yeah, it felt, in a way, I mean, of course, it felt, I was aware of kind of the social hierarchies in some of the struggles, but it was also refreshing to be in Amsterdam, where it felt like, okay, if Nell and Otto do get some money,
Yeah.
they are somehow actually can rise above their station.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Especially for Otto, it wouldn't just be, no, you're a black man, you can't even own it, right? You can't have anything.
No.
In fact,
and as I said, like finding that proof that a black man did own, you know, that's big. Like property ownership
Right.
of like, that's like the equivalent of owning a mansion on Park
right.
Avenue or Mayfair in London. And I felt very vindicated because there was a little bit of a pushback on that with my first novel, that I was being idealistic, that, you know, I had a gay man and a black man and a woman with proto-feminist sympathies. You know, there are a few pockets in the British press that, oh, this is so idealistic. But actually, it's always about who gets to write the history, who decides what's useful.
What to highlight, what's
valuable,
champion.
and what to celebrate, and then it trickles down, and we forget that there were other people, you know, in the novel there's a lot of Portuguese Hebrew merchants who had brought wealth from their plantations in Brazil, and they brought all their enslaved labourers with them, and then they were forced to emancipate them on Dutch soil, because again slavery was illegal. But
But we
it's
can
funny.
still have the tea and the sugar and the...
Well, that's it,
Right.
isn't it? And that's the kind of, it's that thing where you can enjoy all these worldly goods without having to feel guilty about where they've come from.
I think we do a bit of that now,
Oh, a
don't we?
little bit. Yeah, you know. I mean, it's absolutely a sort of microcosmic commentary on our society. Like, I feel like this is such a modern society, and there are so many leaps and bounds being made in science and in travel, but obviously as well, like on fairly brutal practices as well.
Well, I'm glad that you went there, despite the British critics. So what's next for you? What are you, the dreaded question, and is there going to be a
third?
Well,
I feel like I can't say never, because I said never before, and now
look what
what's
happened.
Certainly not for a while. It's like I have to sort of. I feel a bit like a child going to her toy box as an adult, and like, oh, the familiar, you know, dolls.
Your miniatures.
Yeah, my miniatures. I'm this sort of arch miniaturist. I have a contract for 2 children's novels, and I actually have started it here on, not right now, but on a plane trip. I sort of had a little bit of an idea, so I've managed 1,000 words.
Okay.
Great. So yeah, that's next. And then who knows? I wrote a children's book called The Restless Girls, which was a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses. And there's noises to make it into a stage musical, and I think it'd be wonderful. It's set in the Jazz Age, and
Wow.
12 girls who go dancing every night down a tree palace. It's so much fun. So I think a bit of fun next.
Okay.
Writing
Something
books is hard.
a little less dark.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this was amazing. I'm sure, any questions here for the audience?
I'm just interested in how much time and effort it took you to really establish that, in your own mind, the history of the complexity of the Amsterdam
Yeah.
during the Golden Age.
I started my notes and idea for a short story, which became The Miniaturist in 2009. So it's been 13 years.
And why there? Why Amsterdam
Because
during that
it
time?
was honestly because I just went on holiday there.
Okay.
And I went to the Rijksmuseum on a 3-day mini break from London on the Eurostar train, and I saw this cabinet house, which is, you know, quite large and very imposing. It's made of oak and elm, veneered in tortoiseshell, shot through with pewter. 820 craftsmen filled its rooms. If she had, and it was Petronella Ortmann was the woman's name who owned it, if there was a new member of the family, she had them miniaturized and put in. It's kind of like a proto Facebook, because it's like my life on display. She would put it in the entrance hall. Ceramics and porcelain shipped in from Japan, miniature cutlery, little hidden cellars with real barrels of beer. I mean, it was just, I was just mesmerized, and I thought, what kind of society permitted this kind of expenditure? For beds you can't sleep in, food you can't eat. And of course the city of Amsterdam was around me at the time as a kind of perfectly preserved version of this woman's wealth. So that's really where it started, but I just had in my mind this idea of these two women opposing one another like pawns on a chessboard, and obviously in Dutch painting you see a lot of black and white flooring.
Right.
And I just, in a kind of, as if Marin, her sister-in-law, was a bit like a Mrs. Danvers figure, and she was the young bride turning up. It's quite an old trope. And so from there, that's where it all came about. But I was working as a PA, a personal assistant in the City of London at the time, just, temp work. And after those 3 days I had to come back, and so the rest of the book was just written using Google Maps and trotting through the canals on the computer and reading a couple of history books that were incredibly well researched and written. As I said earlier, the Dutch visual lexicon is so wide reaching, they're very immediately recognisable, that kind of Vermeer look, and the Hoek and Jan Steen and Hobbema and Ruysdael, there's just so many of them. It was just such an unprecedented period of art history. So all of it really happened in my house in London, and just really plugging away. I ended up, I think, doing 17 drafts of that one.
Wow.
Over a period of, so I started it in 2009 and it published 5 years later. And then with this one, this was a very different experience. I wrote it through lockdown, which is again odd because this is a novel about a family stuck within four walls, dreaming of a bucolic escape, and whether that's actually going to be ambiguous in its benefits or not. And I think, the first one first two drafts were about 23 months, and I just chucked them after that. They weren't right. And I handed the second draft over to my editor in the November of 2020. And as soon as I did it, I knew it was wrong. It was that, that moment where something's released and you suddenly see it's all its flaws. And I wrote her an email saying, this is wrong, I've just realised everything I need to do. And then I started again in the January of the next year and wrote it in 12 weeks. And so I worked out, I threw about 300,000 words away over, which is just, it's very masochistic and I wouldn't recommend it. I'd rather just work on the words I have, but it was a tough one to get right. And also I found out I was pregnant on New Year's Eve that December, and then started work that January, and it was very odd because the book mirrored the trimesters. I finished it in 12 weeks and then another 12 weeks, and then I'm going off on one now, but my parents' house burned down, and they came to live with us, which is again weird, having your family move in with you whilst the rest of the world opens up. And it's a book about finding a home. And the day I finished the book, 2 weeks before I gave birth, my parents found a new home. So it's just
it all makes sense now.
Yes.
It was a very, more than my other novels, it felt like a novel that really mirrored my life, even though obviously I'm not a Dutch.
In another life.
In another life, maybe. My friend actually she's an artist, she wants to paint me as Nella, which would be very weird, but we'll
Hopefully
see.
it's better than the painting than Thea's
Oh gosh,
lover.
Thea's lover does this terrible portrait.
There's an incredible, I don't know, is this a spoiler? It's not a spoiler,
I don't
right?
think so.
But Thea's involved with this man, and he's an artist, and she's romanticized him. He's actually just a set
He
painter,
is the
but
most gifted
he's a set painter, but she's like, he's amazing, and he's like, come in, I've got this present for you, and he shows her this painting of her, and it's just awful. It's just god awful. That had me chuckling.
Yeah.
quite a long time. So.
But there's that thing, isn't it? Like, I don't know if you ever had this, like growing up, like maybe you had a girlfriend or a boyfriend who sort of played you a song or something that was absolutely awful, and you're like, oh, that was
So
great.
great.
So
Yes.
good.
Everyone's nodding. So.
Yeah, yeah.
Everyone's
we do.
Yes.
Someone playing a good harp for them.
Yeah.
They were wonderful.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank
they
you.
really
Thank you so much for
Thank
coming.
you.
Lovely.